Before we get into the episode, please could you do me a favour and hit the follow or subscribe button wherever you're listening to the podcast. You'll be actively helping our community to grow and for us to reach more people, and it allows us to get great new guests on for future episodes.
Art versus the Algorithm with Will Preisner.
Welcome to Art versus the Algorithm. I'm your host, Will Preisner, and in this episode, I'm joined by artist, activist, and writer Emma Shapiro. Together, we dive into the fight against censorship in art, the societal stigmas surrounding the human body, and how Emma's groundbreaking projects like exposure therapy and Don't Delete Art are leading the fight for artistic freedom. It's a conversation about creativity, activism, and challenging the norms that shape how we see art today. I've also just launched my photography website, willpreisner.com, where you can explore my latest work and opportunities to get involved in it. There's a link in the podcast description. So, without further ado, let's go on to episode 5 with Emma Shapiro. Hi Emma, thank you for coming on Art versus the Algorithm. To give the listeners some context, I want to first ask you how you would describe your approach to utilising the human form and the nude in your work as an artist.
Well, thank you, Will, so much for inviting me to be on this podcast. I think it's a really great concept, and I really look forward to all the other guests that you're going to be including in this. It's obviously a topic that is really close to my heart and my practice, and basically how I spend my time. So, yeah, the human body. Well, the way I describe it is it's, for me as an artist, it is my main tool. I studied painting in university, but I knew pretty quickly that painting wasn't my language. And so when I left school, I became an art model. That's how I ended up making my living for a good number of years in New York City and around. And it's still a practice that I hold and anywhere I go. Currently, I live in Spain now. And that was the first thing I sought out when I first moved here was where I could model and where I could host drawing groups to just be around the practice. I find it to be a really integral practice to being an artist is studying the human form. There's a reason why, no matter where you go in the world, there are artists who want to study the human body. And in my opinion and the way that my mind formed around this, especially when I was working at the Art Students League of New York, it was an extremely healing practice. I can talk more about this later, but basically I always felt that the artists were really drawing themselves. They weren't drawing me. And so taking that and pulling that into my own practice was a very liberating experience. And therefore my own body has become my tool. And I respect and try to protect other artists who are also using the body.
And from what you've just mentioned, that the artists that you modeled for, you saw that they would draw a sense of themselves in the drawing of you. Is that just kind of completing that circle for you to model yourself and also focus on the nude female form?
Well, I guess in some way that is correct, though there was this other thing about modeling for me that I was able to remove my own identity from my modeling practice. It gave me this freedom from my body in this way. So I'm able to kind of look at my own body in an objective way, or maybe just a sentimental way. And I guess I don't actually just use the female form in my work. I just use my body, and my body happens to be the female form. And because of the problems that come up with that, the censorship, the objectification, the assumption that what I'm exploring is particularly feminist or particularly sexual, that of course has led me into the other things that I've ended up doing, including activism, writing about this topic, and ultimately really embracing my own personal politics as a feminist and a anti-censorship advocate. But as an artist in particular, I still maintain a practice in which I am kind of objectively just using my body as the best way to express myself.
So to take us back to the beginning of your journey, you kind of touched on it just a moment ago, but to take us back to the very beginning of your journey as an artist, how did you start out and decide that it would be the path that you chose? Can you pinpoint any particular moment or event that was the catalyst for that?
Not exactly. It's just something I always liked, something I was always celebrated for as a child. I guess I was good at it, and it was a safe space for me. I returned basically to these atelier classrooms because that was my safe space. I just love that environment of an easel or easels around a model stand. But I really wanted to study history. And then I was accepted into a very good art school in the United States. And my father made a deal with me that I would spend 1 year at this art school. And if I still after that wanted to leave and go study history, then I'd go do that. But he wanted me to give it a shot. And of course, I ended up liking it and staying and then finding my own way back to history in my own ways later.
And you say, it seems interesting to me that your father had the opposing view to what I would expect, that he wanted you to pursue something artistic as opposed to kind of history, I suppose, which should be a more somewhat traditional degree. Did your parents have quite a big influence on your decision to do art then?
Yes, I certainly did. I mean, I'm a very lucky person in that they were more than just supportive. They were pointing me in a particular direction at a certain point because they believed in me. They believed in me no matter what I wanted to do, but they believed that this could result in something special for me. My father wanted to be an artist, but was pressured to go to law school by his family. So I think he wanted to make sure that I never felt pressured to not study art. And my mother is a writer, so we have a lot in common now, basically, as far as like forging our own path creatively and empathize with each other, sympathize with our journeys. When it came to using my own body in my own art practice or becoming an art model, there was a bit of maybe a little bit of a worry about what I was doing, but I've proven to them that it's valuable and didn't ruin my future by having my nude body in different places in the world.
We'll definitely come back to that point because that's something that's going to be quite important. But what was it that did you think that they saw in you that made them want to kind of push you artistically?
You know what? I've never really asked them that question. I'm not so sure. I guess they just really were proud of a talent that they saw in me, I don't feel like I'm special in that. I also teach students that I think are like enormously gifted. I'm surrounded by artists now and have been for many years. And, we're all had our gifts as children. And what hurts me the most is actually when people get directed away from art, they're told or believe that they're not good at it. And it's just because nobody really encouraged them or nobody saw what it was they were good at when it came to art. I think I was like maybe lucky that I happened to be good at maybe a traditional being able to draw what I was looking at. But that isn't the only way to make art,
No, I agree. I mean, I was terrible at drawing what I was looking at when I was younger, but my interest was film. And I was very lucky that my parents supported me in that. Didn't necessarily push me, but they believed in me saying that that was what I wanted to pursue. And without them, I don't think I would have ended up in a career working in film. So you feel quite fortunate that you had that environment to grow up in?
Yes, I really recognize that I was an extremely fortunate young artist and that I was able to pursue this. I have no regrets about that.
Do you think, was there anything in your upbringing that you think had an influence and shaped your approach and mentality to nudity in art?
As a child, nudity wasn't considered a shameful thing. I think that, when people, that's a big thing to overcome for a lot of people if they're in their home life or in their particular culture, society, or whatever is their structure. If they're taught that it's maybe shameful or dangerous to be nude or to see nudity, then it really affects them and it can be really hard to shake. I wasn't raised that way, so that was influential. And then I very early on was really interested in art history, and so was seeing a lot of this content, this historical practice. So when it came to though using my own body, like I said, always been kind of intrigued by my own body, but the first time that I modeled, it certainly was a scary experience. I wasn't sure if didn't know what I was getting myself into, but it was something I fell in love with right away. And that's something that you can ask any art model. It's because they love it. And there's something special there that speaks to people. And they come from all different backgrounds.
And you've mentioned you pose nude in your photography and video features in your art projects. When I was researching for this discussion, I read a quote that you wrote regarding your use of self-portraiture in your work. And you said, self-portraiture has been an essential touchstone for me. I use it to locate who I remember myself to be and witness how I adapt to new circumstances and lives by twisting this concept of who I am into them. I'm reminded that even who I believe myself to be distorts and changes over time. And I felt there's quite a lot to unpack in this quote, and I just wanted to focus on a couple of elements of it. What do you mean that you use self-portraiture to locate who you remember yourself to be? Why is this important for you to do this?
I guess I kind of envision my body as an anchor, no matter what the changes are going on and how my life has adapted or changed. You know, I still am in my body, and I find it just curious. I've started to sort of see it as sort of, I've been kind of questioning it, like not questioning it as in I don't believe it, but like asking it a question. I return to my body all the time to sort of continually ask, like, who are you? Who are you? Or who were you in this moment? It's not that I don't know myself, but I'm very open to the fact that things have changed, things change, my concepts change. I'm open to like my concepts about my own artwork changing. There's a lot to be understood in retrospect about our own psyches, about the reasons we make certain decisions. I think being a kind of person like you who is just following one foot in front of the other, trusting your gut and like making decisions based off of the last decision you made, based off of what you believe is the next best decision to make. You know, you don't end up having this vision of yourself in the future. You just have this vision of yourself now. And so I want to look back at that, 10 steps down the line. I want to look back at where I was 10 steps ago and say like, who were you then? And my body is the best way for me to kind of locate that, because it is the one thing that hasn't changed. And I do use a lot of imagery like of myself in the past in my work. It isn't all the current imagery of myself. And I like to overlay that and play with that concept of it being different selves in a multiverse kind of way.
I'll be honest with you, when I read that, I was so fascinated by that quote. I was trying to unpack it myself. And the idea that you kind of have some separation from yourself in order to kind of analyze where you were at a certain moment in time. I find that very interesting. I suppose it's not too dissimilar to looking back on a family photograph or a photograph of, myself as a teenager. But you having that awareness whilst doing that you were a different person then, that's not something that I personally have ever had. And I think by reading your quote kind of made me consider to look at those images differently because of the constant evolution of who I am as a person. Is that correct, I suppose, in terms my interpretation of your approach to that?
Yeah, I think that that's definitely correct. I have a lot of thoughts around it, but that is definitely like the essence of what it is. It's just that, this is a touchstone. My body as a touchstone to different moments and different mentalities.
And is that because your body's constantly changing and moving through time?
Well, it's moving through time for sure. I don't think much about my body changing, though eventually I'm sure, once I've accumulated all of this work over time, that'll be especially evident, of course. But I think I'm maybe more of a physicality than my body, maybe.
Okay, I see. And it seems with this in mind that memory, reflection, and interpretation of that plays a pivotal part in your work. Is that correct? And why is that the case to you?
I feel like I don't have a very good memory. Like, I'm always envious of my friends who can like recall all things about like high school or like all things about different parts of their life. And I'm like, gosh, what's wrong with me that I don't remember that? And it's not because I like was doing anything that especially would obliterate those memories necessarily. It's just that, I don't know, do I not place enough importance on things? Am I not sentimental enough? And so with the work that I'm exploring memory, it's more like I'm exploring my own lack of memory. And I used to keep a diary. For many years, I kept diaries. And then I had stopped along the way. And I guess this is kind of my way of like creating a retrospective diary of time and maybe creating new ones.
It seems that like self-awareness and developing that underpins all of this. Has that been a journey for you?
Yeah, kind of see it from exterior perspective at times, or during a lot of it. When it's all like my personal investigation, like in my artwork, I'm not pushing that on the viewer at all. I actually don't think the artwork is very visually personal, aside from the fact that it is my own body that I'm using in all of it, because I want it to be open to interpretation. I want people to kind of see their own memories in stuff, or like recognize something or start in a mental pattern. So these are my own rationales for the work. not the visual representation of the work, but I'm constantly trying to locate my psyche between my psychological and physical space where I am. I started to think of it in terms of when you look directly at a star, you can't see it, but you can only see it when you look away from it. That's kind of the way it's been feeling for me lately.
Okay, interesting. I mean, and looking at your work, it seems that, like, from some of your recent work, you often tend to like manipulate, fragment, fracture, and sort of reshape the nude female form and nude form in general. What's your motivation behind doing this?
Well, my personal exploration with that is it came out of me wanting to represent the mental contortions I felt like I was starting to make at that time, which is that, I moved to a new country. I learned a new language. Upon moving to this new country, I live half my life in that language and then, half my life in English. And I have a whole new family here and a new life and contorting into that, like trying to maintain the core while shifting around it has kind of been the sort of the rationale behind this series that include these bodies that I called Corpus, and then other works that have to do with this kind of contorting. That's what that's been about. And then I think I've been fragmenting some things further and separating pieces of the body away from the body. And I have to say, I'm not so sure what that means yet. I have some inkling, but not enough for me to fully comment on. But that doesn't mean it doesn't mean anything.
I was wondering myself if it was to do with like objectification of the human body.
I think you're probably onto something there. It's with my work with censorship, that's definitely been on my mind for the last few years and is a topic I'm dealing with. So I wouldn't be surprised that that's the way it's starting to manifest itself in my artwork.
Yeah, the reason for my interpretation of it in that way was just because of through my work as a cinematographer, and that I'm always very conscious of the way that I frame things and break up people's bodies when I'm shooting and what the message behind that is or could be. So I was maybe coming at it from a filmmaking perspective, but it's interesting to hear it's a journey for you. And you mentioned, is it Corpus? Am I pronouncing that right?
Yeah, the Corpus are basically whenever I have these bodies that I've been breaking up, cutting up, putting back together, I've been referring to them as Corpus. Cuerpo is not a correct term. The word for body in Spanish is cuerpo, but cuerpa is kind of like a feminist twist on it. It's a word that doesn't exist.
You've mentioned that it's an investigation, that it's part of an investigation. How does that mixing up of and reshaping of the bodies and of your body, how does that aid that investigation that you're kind of on in your artwork?
To do it in the first place was kind of like this gut impulse. I had this need to do it. I was like, I need to do this. And so I set it all up and started playing with that and knew that something interesting was going to come out of it. And as you can tell, like I tend to read into my own work. I allow myself to work intuitively and trust that I'm exploring something and then might identify something I'm exploring and then push that further. But with these, the interesting thing that came out of that I wasn't fully expecting was like how much they feel like puppets. Like they kind of feel like marionette-like when I'm making them anyway. And that got me thinking a lot about like, oh, what am I performing? Where am I within that performance in life or even like with making? And I started working more with a theme of kind of like stage set kind of setups that may or may not be so clear in the work yet, but it's something that I've been kind of investigating. So it's taken me more in that direction of who's behind the body, how do they break apart and reassemble themselves, and for whom and for what purpose. I'm sorry if it's a little bit like nebulous.
No, it's fascinating to hear and just to understand like how much of like a mirror your work is to yourself and your self-awareness of that. I think that's really interesting. And is this project still ongoing then? Is this something that you're still creating the Corpus?
Yeah, that's something I'm going to continue to investigate. And I've got some plans for different offshoots in which I'll still be using the Corpus. But yeah, I need to sit down and start investigating in order to really understand that more. I currently have some of that series in an exhibition here in Valencia. And so it's been a great exercise for me to talk to the public about it and, gotten me excited to work more with that theme. It's a lovely group exhibition that is exploring kind of sort of psycho-futuristic physicality of female form, my own verbalization of the take on it. And it's a small exhibition here in Valencia, but right now is the opening season for the galleries in Valencia. And it's an honor to be included in that series here, especially as somebody who isn't from here. The gallery scene in Spain can be reticent to bring in outside talent, and I think that's changing a bit in Valencia now.
I'd like to move on to chat about some of your art modeling. You said that you previously posed nude for other artists. Do you still? Is that stopped now?
No, I don't have any private artists that I work for anymore currently, but I do pose at some just regular drawing groups around Valencia. And it's an integral part of like me. It's like my form of meditation. I really need to touch that. It's a way to touch grass for me. And so I always find ways to do it no matter where I'm living. So yes, I continue it. But yeah, of course, I was doing it full time for a good 6 years in New York City before I left to pursue my own art practice.
I see. And was that specifically for private artists or a mix of drawing groups and private artists? Where did you do your modeling?
Well, it was all over, and it was a really cool job to have. I mean, I've always liked to work for myself, and so I got to do that, and it takes you everywhere. Private art studios, drawing groups, like secret drawing groups, major schools like universities. My primary home base was the Art Students League of New York, but I was working for artists all over the city, outside of the city, all kinds of things. And it was always traditional work, sculpture, drawing, painting. But yeah, I was more of a traditional art model, atelier style.
I see. And what was it that kind of made you want to start doing that?
I just graduated from university. I was feeling very uncertain about how on earth I was going to use my degree. Like I mentioned before, I knew painting wasn't my language. I had already strayed from painting like years prior, but was still like in the painting department. I was lucky my university was open to different concepts, but I still hadn't found my voice as an artist either. And I went back home, back to the city anyway, where I grew up in, just Alexandria, Virginia, outside of DC, and went back to the same classrooms that like I had gone to when I was a child, like my touchstone, which were these atelier rooms. But I couldn't afford to like take more classes, and nor did I really need to. They didn't need any gallery assistants. They didn't need anything else, but the only job that was open was art modeling. And I was like, well, I guess I'll try this. And they scheduled me for a class like maybe a few weeks out, and I like put it in the back of my mind. It was just sort of something to try to make some money with. But from the very, very first time I did it, it spoke to me. It was something I understood. And it takes a very particular kind of temperament to do art modeling. There's all different kinds of people who do it, all different kinds of creatives. Like most of the models I've worked with are not visual artists. They often are some kind of creative writers, a lot of writers actually.
To take you back to that first time that you did it, like you just mentioned, how was that first experience? Can you sort of take me through the emotions that you felt and the thoughts that crossed your mind, like before, during, and after it? Like, what was it like?
Leading up to it, it was triggering, not because I knew the environment already. I knew it was a safe environment, so I wasn't worried about that. And I also understood what you're looking at when you look at a model. By then, I'd been looking at models for years and years. So I knew that like I was never judging a model. It's very different from any other way that our bodies are perceived in society. I already knew that, but it still was triggering because I long had dealt with disliking my own body, feeling inadequate, like body dysmorphia and disordered eating in my past. And it had been a struggle for me, very much so. So I was a bit worried about that. But instead, it was immediately a healing process to be there and like in front of all those eyes, but trusting the space and knowing that they were not judging, they were just absorbing and digesting. And it was part of an art canon. I use my nude form still in my work because it takes me out of time, as well as like me trying to locate myself. It still is like the nude is a timeless thing. Clothing is a time-oriented thing. It says a lot about where you are in time. So it felt like I was in the company of all the greatest paintings I'd loved my whole life, and then I could see it for the models that were in it. It was enlightening. And it was hard. I mean, and I took a very hard pose that was like very painful because I didn't know my body well enough. And it takes you a long time to get to know your body and know what it can do. Not everybody's body will do the same thing. And so I took one that was a very difficult pose, but I was okay with working through it. I'm not deterred by endurance exercises. So, but the mental endurance is the thing that's like primarily what is the key to any art model, is the ability to have a mental endurance for the amount of time that you have to be up there.
So overall, did you kind of leave feeling kind of empowered by the experience? If you entered it fearful or hesitant, you suddenly felt kind of like energized by the situation.
Yeah, it was like finding something like that. It belongs to you. You know, I realized that I'd found my future. I didn't know where it would lead me. I didn't know at the time that it would take me to New York. I didn't know that it would lead my own art practice or like everything that I have now. But it was like finding the right direction. That was the next step. I knew that.
I see. And then moving forward to today and your how you pose nude in your self-portraiture, has that feeling changed since then? From when you first did it and when you first started out to today, in terms of how it feels being in a room with artists looking at you, or being alone, being the model in your own artwork?
Doing it for myself, it takes a while. Like if I'm in the studio and working on something where I'm using like new imagery of myself, if I'm working on new video that includes my body or something, it'll take a while for me to shake the concept, like to shake the pressure that I need to say something with this. I need to, like, my body, this needs to mean something. My body needs to mean something in this. It takes me a while to shake that. And I'm not able to really produce anything until I can finally shake that and just use my body in the way in which I saw my body when I was a model. Because when I was a model, that wasn't up to me. I had a job to do, but I was there for the meaning that the other artists wanted to put into it. I didn't have to provide the meaning. And that was very freeing. And that's really like where my creativity can come out. And being the artist and the model, there's a balancing act that has to take place there, where if I'm carrying the pressure to have the meaning in my own body as a model, I can't create it. I have to do it separately, if that makes any sense. But like, so it takes a little while. But that's, once I'm able to get past that point, then I'm able to move and use my body in the same way that I did when it was freeing, when it was just me doing the job I loved.
And that plays into what we were talking about earlier, about you kind of separating yourself from your work and who you are in your own, when you see yourself in your own work. It's fascinating to me that when you're creating the artwork as well, that you need to create that boundary between being the artist and being the model. And by doing that, it kind of helps to aid your creativity.
Yeah, interesting. I haven't really verbalized all that before, so it's kind of enlightening for me too.
That's great. That's what I'm here to try and do. And we did touch on this earlier, but just to go a little further into it, when you first started out as a nude model, what was the reaction of your friends and family and on personal relationships?
Yeah, it's inevitable that people will misunderstand it, and always have. I would say, like I mentioned, my parents, for example, weren't so worried about me doing it as a job. I mean, I don't think they knew the extent to which I was like going to private art studios, because I think that is something to maybe worry about for anybody going anywhere into somebody's private space for whatever reason. But it wasn't really so much as that. But like when I started using my body in my own artwork, that's when they started to worry a bit, just because they, I don't know, they understood soon enough. The harder thing was always socially. Dating or friends even, people would misunderstand it. thinking that it was because, I was an exhibitionist, or a lot of people would think it was because it had to do with sexuality. They would assume that I was like a hypersexual person or whatever. And that played a lot of frustrating roles in my social life. People who would distrust me, partners who would distrust it or believe me to be somebody else. That happened a lot. And even from sometimes the students in those classrooms. And that was always very frustrating to me, obviously, and something that has really gave me a foundation of like concern. And the reason why I do a lot of activist work is just like how we assume we cannot extricate nudity from sexuality and like danger, especially when it's a female form. And I've seen it firsthand because I am fully allied with any artist that is using the body in that way or trying to describe those themes. But I'm often put into the wrong box just because I use my body in my work. Like, I am not speaking to sexual themes in my own artwork at this stage anyway. And I never used my body as a model for those themes. But no matter what, it'll still be put in that wrong box. Doesn't mean I'm not an ally to artists who are using it or models who want to use their bodies that way, but it can be very sticky. And so, yes, it was pretty difficult. My husband now, ultimately, I needed to find an artist who had also grown up drawing nude models, who could actually have some basis of understanding of that practice and what it meant.
I could hear the frustration in your voice, remembering the way that people would kind of project their own interpretations of what being an art model is, a nude model is, onto you, as opposed to kind of trying to understand it from your perspective. I've had similar reactions from family and friends and in personal relationships. And it's interesting to hear that there's some, obviously we've grown up in very different situations. We're far away from each other. We've had very similar reactions from people around us. And is this a source of ongoing frustration that this is still something that goes on?
It happens less with my personal artwork these days, maybe because I'm no longer in my 20s or something. I don't know what the difference is necessarily, but maybe because I'm not out there necessarily trying to break into any friendship groups or dating. Like, I'm not confronting it all the time, having to explain myself. And I'm surrounded by this misinterpretation all the time, given the activism work that I do with Don't Delete Art. I mean, the artists that are primarily coming to us are artists whose artwork is being misjudged. The assumptions are flying about what their artwork means. And so I'm just confronted with that on a daily basis. It is constantly a fresh frustration for me, even if it's not on my own behalf, on the behalf of how it's just stunting so much creativity in the world.
You've kind of nicely brought us onto the topic of Don't Delete Art there and censorship and your activism more broadly. I'd like to talk about. How would you sort of describe the current state of censorship on online platforms? And what impact do you think this is having offline? I know this is a very big question, but I just thought I'd try you on it.
It's a big question, but it is pretty simple. The answer is kind of simple. It's that the state of censorship, my particular focus is online, is that it is constantly evolving, but not necessarily in the right direction. And there are new frontiers for artists to be standing at to defend their work every day. So the state of online censorship is basically that we're living in an increasingly anti-sex society. Of course, these things ebb and flow over time, but like our online spaces are being actively dictated by very conservative politics and conservative pressures. And this is something that is very real and very concerning for a lot of different online spaces for a lot of different reasons. And the artists are basically the canary in the coal mine, along with like sex workers and other kinds of erotic content. We're the ones who are going to be basically just erased from history because we cannot be in these online spaces now. Artists will be erased. Like, there major groups of artists are unable to show their work, sell their work, or even make their work. And this is all happening in silence, because if something is taken off the internet, there's nowhere to yell about it, basically. It makes it very difficult for artists who are facing what we call censorship. It's more complicated than that, but that is like a key word to use to get it to understand this concept. When this happens to artists online, it's not like it's happening like at a major museum or like a public space where you can then put up a poster saying like, or go protest, or gather your friends and your community to advocate for you or to shout about it. When it happens online, it happens silently, and it can happen in a very underhanded way. Like right now, what we're seeing, the way it operates on, say, for example, Instagram, is that art is being less often removed, but far more often given no possibility for it to be disseminated. And then an artist really has nowhere to go. So it can be very insidious and confusing and frustrating for artists. This situation, as has been going on for years, has already affected the art world. I mean, artists have changed their entire practice just to be able to have an online presence at all. And this, of course, is affecting the most marginalized artistic communities we have. Women artists who are especially portraying the female body, trying to change the narrative around how we see the female body in art history and current day, and what objectification means, basically taking back the male gaze that has become almost an impossibility, because the structure of a lot of these online spaces is built with a male gaze as an integral facet to it, and any alteration is considered deviant. So female artists, LGBTQ artists who are exploring themes of identity or sexuality or whatever, those are especially at risk and under attack. And the way, like, say, the politics are moving in the United States are very already restricted in online spaces. Refugee and artists who are living under political regimes are obviously extremely constricted in the kind of artwork that they can put online, and even the way that international platforms regulate their messages. So it's affecting the kind of artwork that we even see in the world. A gallery may be less apt to show the artwork of an artist that they know they won't be able to share online. I mean, that will affect their decision-making in the future, and has. So we're deeply in the midst of a real purge of a lot of artistic integrity and exploration. And it's happened almost silently and invisibly to most of the art community, which is what puts me on my soapbox and has me talking like this, because I find this to be a very pivotal and important moment in the history of art right now.
And you've been at the receiving end of this censorship.
Yeah, sure. I am constantly dealing with it. I've experienced every form of it online, but I also know artists who are way more tightly bound and unable to extricate themselves from it. So even if it stops happening to me, it's going to still be happening to other artists.
We're looking for figurative artists, photographers, models, and activists. If you'd like to be a guest on Art versus the Algorithm, reach out to us on our social channels at Art vs Algorithm, and let's chat.
You said that they're increasingly using different tactics as opposed to just removing it. They're choosing to hide it in certain ways. And they're not always informing the artists they're doing it. And the artist isn't always aware that it is happening. Do you have any thoughts on this approach that they take?
Well, in a lot of ways, it did used to be a lot worse. Say about, like 5 years ago, there was basically no appeals process at all. And accounts were being shut down left and right. And artists had no option. There was no one to contact. There was no way to appeal or explain yourself. So there have been accountability structures put in place over time that are positive. So appeals, oversight board, now them even telling you why they removed a piece, like having to identify exactly what it was in their terms and conditions that they believe you violated. Now with the recommendations, guidelines, as vague as it still kind of is, they're telling you what it was and why they are restricting your ability to share that work. So all those things are positive, and a lot of it has been because of regulations, like internet regulations. So the DSA in Europe had a big role to play in, say, why now a company like Instagram is required to tell you what rule you violated and give you access to an appeal. So these companies are balancing. They're trying to, abide by regulations, but also respond to different kinds of pressures they experience. So like, while an artist like me or many other artists who use the body in their work, even if they are self-censoring already, and self-censorship is a whole other part of this web here, artists have found all different kinds of ways to self-censor, including making artwork they might not have made at all just because they have to self-censor. That work is not maybe being removed, but it's being downranked because they are also trying to make sure that they're appeasing conservative pressures on them, trying to play with their stakeholders. What these companies are doing, it is a right that we at Don't Delete Art and any activist, a digital rights activist, we avidly protect. This is them exercising their freedom of speech, their ability to curate, which is why we're constantly trying to educate them, negotiate with them, try to explain to them how they're misapplying their rules. It isn't a problem for them to have those rules, but they're misapplying certain things. They need to allow for better artistic perspectives when they're creating their terms and conditions, when they're dealing with trust and safety, when they are developing the AI that is moderating and monitoring their systems. The artistic perspectives aren't in the room. And we also now need to especially make sure that, say, our lawmakers are also taking freedom of expression into account when they're calling for the removal of offensive material online, because that is such a broad statement. These companies are going to be removing art left and right because they're just trying to abide by vague regulation that is meant to protect children, but is not specific enough and not helpful in the end.
No, and there are potentially other ways, I suppose, to be able to protect children beyond just removing the art from the platform or hiding it, full stop, that you can prevent access from children in other ways. And do you think this is just overall at odds with what artists have traditionally been? Like, even this entire process of having to negotiate with a corporation with the involvement of governments, do you think it's at odds with what artists have always traditionally been, or have for many years, that they kind of have led and been very instrumental in being defiant of the rules, to push boundaries, to make people question whether the society they live in is right and correct? And I know that DDA and the way that you approach it, you are doing that within the system. But do you think it's at odds with the entire tradition of what artists have previously been doing, that they can't do it from outside the system?
I mean, yeah, it's like we're in a whole new landscape, and one that's going to be continually shifting. Like, we're constantly going to need to be adapting. But yeah, you're right. There's a problem here where, it doesn't align with the history, right? Artists were, and we are, there are always artists who are going to be trying to subvert norms, trying to find new ways of seeing our lives and point out inequities and inequalities and speak for marginalized communities. That will always happen. The problem is that the audiences don't have the opportunity to see it anymore. Like, you start looking at it from that perspective versus like the artist not being able to make that work, but instead the public doesn't have access to that work, it should be even more frustrating. In that case, everybody should be clamoring for the fact that we should be allowed to see these things if we want to, or like we need to have access. Like, we all have a right to be able to enjoy art and the kind of art we want to see. Like Instagram, for example, and all these spaces, they propose this promise of just like unending ability to reach an audience. And that was amazing. And it really changed the art world. It changed everything about it. It made it so that I could sit here in Valencia, Spain, and somebody in New York could see my work, for example. It made it so that artists who are disabled don't have to leave their house. They don't have to move to a city that isn't accommodating to them in order for them to make their work and find an audience. It made it so refugee artists could find support outside of their countries. So it's an amazing thing that still functions in a lot of those same ways. It's just that it doesn't function that way for all artists, and is limiting our ability to change the art world the way that it might normally adapt itself to new and changing times. And yes, you're right. We're in this weird moment where it kind of makes it impossible to protest against, because where will that protest take place? If it can't take place where the event is happening, then where does it happen? And this is something with Don't Delete Art. We're constantly trying to find the right places to place our message, for us to reach the art community, to at least make sure people are educated about what's happening and why it's happening, so that they might be able to use their voices to amplify the message. It's an effort. It's certainly an effort.
It's one that's well worth continuing with, though. And I have another side question just related to something that you said about self-censoring and self-censoring your own work. Do you think there's a danger, we're talking about children seeing things or people in general seeing things. Do you think there's a danger that the sort of bodies that we're allowed to see, or that are more likely to make it through a censorship process, there's a consistency between that from different artists, models, photographers, that they all censor it in a similar way? Do you think there's a potential dangerous impact on people seeing the human body in that way?
Yeah, sure. And, there's all Instagram culture and filters and everything has really warped a lot of the ways that people see themselves and see the human body. It all depends on what your influences are online. And we're all living in our own personalized newsfeed, right? It's like my personal newsfeed. What I search online, the environment that I'm placing myself in is a very diverse environment. I see all kinds of bodies in all different ways. That's because I've curated that for myself. And if somebody isn't actively doing that, we already know that what they're being fed is unattainable imagery, especially of the female body. I mean, this is something that hasn't been fixed and is certainly maybe getting worse. There's all different kinds of studies and they go in different directions, but it is a strange thing. Like, there's people always speculating, like if an alien was looking at Instagram, they wouldn't know what women had nipples. They would just think that they have these orbs. It makes you wonder, like in the future, when our stuff is hieroglyphs that somebody else is reading, what are they going to think we thought bodies were?
I mean, on this topic, you founded exposure therapy and started that. Can you explain what that is?
That's also like a pretty straightforward thing. I came out of the first time that I experienced censorship of my own artwork, and it was something that happened in person. And it was ultimately told to me that the reason why this was happening was because the work showed my nipples, and so therefore it was pornographic. And I had just left full-time modeling and was doing my own artwork. And so I was coming out of this environment where I was completely comfortable being nude, was around nudity all the time, and it was respected. And so it really shot me back into reality in this very abrupt way in which I was able to see very clearly the hypocrisy and the weirdness of that statement. So I decided, what if I put my nipples on anything, on a trash can? Is that trash can now pornographic or sexy? What on earth does this mean? So I created stickers of my own nipples and started putting them places and taking photos and whatever. And it was pretty hilarious. And then eventually I started an Instagram account about it. And then that was the first time. I mean, I actually had barely dealt with Instagram before then. And that, of course, immediately resulted in me entering into the wonderful online world of censorship of the female body, particularly the female nipple, which is just a perpetually hilarious and absurd line that will never be crossed. So yeah, I started that way. And then the project, I named it, and I started speaking to other people who are experiencing this, having people participate by sending me pictures of their own nipples. It was originally just women, and then it became, if you're female identifying, or if you feel that your body in particular is being targeted for censorship because of your nipples. And I created stickers from a bunch of those and send them all over the world. I had a system in which people could request them from anywhere in the world, and I'd send them for free. And I just accept donations. So they've gone to 40 countries now. And it's just a funny project that is so simple and so revealing. I mean, I've got so many lovely messages from people saying I never thought about it this way until I saw a friend who had this sticker and I was like, what is that? And I'm so happy to have this because like my family like doesn't understand this problem. It helps me explain it to people. It's a really finally needed thing that I was really happy to end up doing this project about, you know?
Yeah, and when I was reading about it on your website, you said all bodies have nipples, but only the female nipple is shamed and censored. Fueled by fear, stigma, and misinformation, we're taught that the female presenting body is provocative, disorderly, and obscene. This mischaracterization results in a world that's unsafe and unequal, a world that sexualizes our bodies regardless of our intent or consent. So am I understanding that correctly, that you're saying that by censoring the female nipple, you believe that we serve to further sexualize it in all contexts, not just the context where it's being censored?
Absolutely. It creates this particular standard. It becomes this rule of controlling women's bodies, you know, telling us that like, well, no matter what, there's going to be this part of you that is more obscene than the part of a male counterpart. So therefore, you are more dangerous. You, just by existing in this form, you are a more dangerous being. You're not allowed to show that. You're going to corrupt children or whatever. And the more we see its pixelation or blocking, or even, you know, there's women who are afraid to show it, covering it up themselves, it creates a sort of like naughty zone that will perpetually keep female presenting bodies as sexual objects. We can only show from here up to like keep our bodies maybe like equal or PC in any way. Anywhere from here down, you're going to run across something that is dangerous and sexual.
Yeah, it reminded me, when I read that, it reminded me of something like that happened about a month ago when I was on a beach in Lisbon, and I was with a friend, and there was someone there decided they were playing sports, playing football on the beach, a girl, and she was with another woman and two other men. They're just playing football, and she was playing football topless. And the person I was with, my friend, she noticed her, and as I looked over, I looked around the beach, and I just noticed that it seemed that everyone on the beach was watching this woman. And since that moment, I've really reflected on the seeing everyone sort of looking at this woman, and how when I was younger, I used to be in similar contexts and not really seem to remember everyone looking in the same way. And I wondered whether what we're talking about now, like this censorship of the female nipple, is driving that crowd of people, the entire beach, to stare at this woman in a way that I couldn't interpret every single individual motivation for it, but it made me question whether that would be happening if it weren't for the way we're interpreting these things now.
That's a perfect example, and actually one that I point to often, which is that topless sunbathing is like classically like continental European practice. In America, it's like always been something that's been a little taboo and only on like private beaches, and even then it's something fought over. But it's a Mediterranean or continental exercise is perfectly natural, perfectly normal. And the rates of topless sunbathing have plummeted over the last 10 years. And the reason for that is Instagram. Like women who are asked why they've changed that practice or why they're less apt to do it don't cite like skin cancer. They don't cite feeling shameful. They don't cite anything except for the way that Instagram has like shaped the mentality over the female body, or they're afraid of somebody posting it to Instagram and affecting their personal accounts or whatever. But basically, I think what you saw on that beach is it really does speak to it, because now people are like, they're seeing it in a dangerous way. Like maybe some people are ogling her, but probably most people are just sort of like, wow, like, you know, I wouldn't do that. Or is she sure she wants to do that? You know, this is like now a dangerous kind of thing to do in our psyche, mostly because we've been taught that, you know, and Instagram being an American company that sort of exported that mentality is very evident as well when it comes to beaches in Spain, beaches in France, beaches in Italy. It's a shame. It's a real shame, but you can see it. You can see the numbers of that plummeting, and you can see it in what your experience was.
Yeah, and she was alone on the beach that we were in, doing that on the beach that we were on. And she did later return to play football and had a bikini on. Like, on reflection, I felt bad for her if she felt the pressure from a sort of crowd of people looking at her to feel the need to have to do that when it's a just completely normal thing to want to do. And it's great to hear your thoughts on that. Do you think that it's cyclical as well? Like, do you think that like by censoring the nipple, we further and further sexualize it, which results in a greater desire for our societies to censor it.
Absolutely. To me, that's like the only reason it's happening, because we have to keep women's bodies as sexualized. And, if you look over time, back when a woman couldn't really show her ankle without being sexualized, and then she couldn't show her shoulders. And then the zone of censorship has been narrowed and narrowed and narrowed to just the areola and the nipple, which is so bizarre, but it's just a way of still saying your body will be sexualized. We're not going to let it not be sexualized. And by doing this, we're ensuring it is. And it just becomes, absolutely cyclical. It won't go away until it is actually normalized, that censorship isn't a required thing.
Do you think that other parts of the female body that are being censored, such as the vulva or the buttocks, do you think that has a similar impact?
Well, so I'm looking at it in terms of equality, equality for bodies. So as long as that is also a standard for male presenting bodies, I see okay, well, it's a different concept to tackle here. The female presenting bodies, nipples being censored makes them twice as likely to be censored than a male. If we're talking about 4 zones versus 2 zones of the human body. So that inequality to me is what I've been targeting. Then if you want to go into the conversation about what is obscene about what we conventionally do, censor genitalia and buttocks, that's a different conversation, which that also is perpetuating people not understanding their own bodies, not understanding what's normal, which I think is dangerous. But the nipple has been my particular focus because it is just so obviously discriminatory against female presenting bodies.
What's the perceived threat, do you think, of the uncensored nude female body? What do those that seek to censor it, what do they fear would happen?
I don't know. It's the same kind of mentality of the way that people still think about, say, if a woman is violated, the impulse to ask, what was she wearing? It just reveals a lot about society's mentality when we are basically putting the blame for whatever happens on the female body, right? And so if people are just afraid of what's going to happen if you show the female body, then they're already placing sort of a blame on it. We have to very much remove ourselves from the idea of women's bodies being objects. It takes out a personhood. It puts the blame on the wrong party. Instead, what we should be focusing on is why is our society objectifying the female body, and how can we better educate ourselves out of that behavior? Women are just as apt to objectify the female body as men, I believe. We're all taught that. So what they're afraid of is themselves. They're afraid of society. They're afraid of this thing that we've learned, and not any reality.
I see. And to move specifically towards art censorship, you've said that you're the editor-at-large for the Don't Delete Art campaign. Is editor-at-large a play on criminality, at large, or just as an aside?
No, it wasn't intended that way. It is funny. And I'll embrace that, sure.
Yeah, because I was imagining you with a mugshot. So Don't Delete Art campaign was how I found you. As you know, I messaged you on Instagram. I've been following the Don't Delete Art campaign on Instagram for some time. It seems to have gained a lot of traction. Can you explain what the origins of the campaign were and what its mission is and what drew you to want to become part of it?
So Don't Delete Art was founded in 2020. It was kind of the result of an activist event in front of, I believe, Facebook headquarters in New York that was staged by the National Coalition Against Censorship and the artist Spencer Tunick. And it was an action called We the Nipple. Spencer Tunick is an artist who's well known for staging these very large scale photos around the world of hundreds of nude bodies. Often people participate in these photo shoots, and they're quite interesting and enlightening for a lot of people. So he staged this thing specifically focused on the nipple ban on Instagram and Facebook. And the result from that action was that Facebook did have a meeting with a handful of artists and human rights groups to discuss this issue. After that, Don't Delete Art was formed. The primary purpose for Don't Delete Art at that time was to advocate for artists who were facing censorship on social media platforms and to create a gallery of art that had been censored on social media platforms, an online gallery. And I joined Don't Delete Art in 2021. I had long also been trying to follow what they were doing and was interested in them because as far as I saw, that was the only group who was formed specifically to speak for artists like myself. And so once I started, using my own voice to speak out on this issue, to give some lectures, to write on this topic, Spencer Tunick brought me in to Don't Delete Art. And since I've joined, I took over writing the newsletter. I originally did it with the artist Savannah Spirit, who is one of the founding curators for Don't Delete Art, as well as Spencer. I should say that Don't Delete Art it's a project that is a collaboration between human rights groups, the Free Muse, the National Coalition Against Censorship in New York, and the Artists at Risk Connection, which is an international artist refugee group and advocating for artists who are facing political pressure. And then artist activists like Spencer, like Savannah, like myself. So once I came in, my focus quickly became not just social media platforms, but across the internet, because I was seeing that artists were experiencing issues, not just with social media, but also with like payment platforms, even like newsletter platforms. This was something that was affecting artists across the board. And I wanted to investigate more about instead of just complaining and just speaking to the choir or whatever, I wanted to make sure that our message was amplified, that we were educating the larger art community, that we were trying to bring in art institutions, that we were doing our best to try to make this a larger issue, to align ourselves with digital rights groups, to make sure that we were advocating at the right levels for the artists that were facing this issue, as well as continuing to receive censorship reports and maintain the gallery and spotlight artists who are facing this issue. So there are a lot of different things that we do. This was very important to me because it felt like I could do something. I was very tired of just feeling frustrated and talking to other artists who are frustrated and feeling like I'm not sure what I can do alone. I don't know what I could do alone. And now with Don't Delete Art, we are a very small team, but we're dedicated, and these groups that we work with are dedicated to us. And we're trying our best to just amplify this message and to bring as many alliances and power that we can to this cause.
So is a natural evolution from exposure therapy. Do you feel like this was it, to go from like activism on your own to activism within a group to become a more powerful entity in a group?
Yeah, definitely being part of a group is, easier. It's not all on your shoulders. You can brainstorm ideas and you end up working on things together. And especially in this environment where like there isn't a centralized place where we understand what's happening online, it's just like we only know what we're able to hear from artists and see for ourselves what's happening online. We're the only group who is particularly advocating for artists who are facing censorship online, visual artists who are facing censorship online. And so through our way of collecting information through the censorship reports or just being online is the way that we can understand the landscape. And so the more eyes, the more people that are part of that group, the more able we are to understand the state of affairs, because it is constantly shifting. So working in a group in that way is real key. There are benefits to working alone, for sure. I don't have to run my ideas by anybody, and I can take risks that you may not be able to take in a group. And there are some projects that I'm hoping to start on my own soon. But Don't Delete Art as a group, as a cause, as something that's backed by human rights organizations is great and gives a lot of credibility for artists to be more apt to trust us. And that's what we want. We want artists to trust us.
At DDA, you have a manifesto on the website that people can sign to support. Like, what are the aims of the manifesto?
So we launched the manifesto, it would have been a little under 2 years ago, and we've been gathering signatures ever since then. We have thousands of signatures now from artists, art workers, art supporters, institutions, and galleries who are signing on this manifesto to essentially call for artist perspectives to be included in content moderation decisions. Basically, we want artists to have a seat at the table at these companies. In this manifesto, we outline, it's pretty brief, but we outline the reasons why this is needed. We outline the fact that there aren't artistic perspectives in these rooms helping to make these decisions, that artists are not being consulted on what we need and what we're seeing online, what's happening to us. We also call for the fact that major art institutions have rarely, if ever, used their powerful voices to talk about this problem, to address this problem. This has been something that has popped up in pop culture, like when it happened to Almodovar during Madres Paralelas, that movie, Penelope Cruz. That's when something popped into pop culture and major institutions and artists spoke out. Then that kind of went away. Vienna Strips on OnlyFans campaign, in which a number of different Vienna museums got together to protest online censorship. That was amazing. And I was hopeful that would spread to other museums, taking up that torch and saying, yeah, that's right. And it didn't. And that's very frustrating. And even recently, the Leopold Museum in Vienna came out again to try to re-spark this conversation among institutions and larger art world movers and shakers. And still it went nowhere. So we're also kind of tisking these institutions for not looking out for the most vulnerable artists in their communities, who they give a lot of lip service to saying that they support. So the manifesto directs attention to that problem as well.
Do you think that some of these institutions are influenced by the funding that they receive from government?
I mean, that certainly could be a concern, particularly in the wake of what we've seen with Israel's attacks in Gaza and the way that different institutions responded to that based off of their funding concerns. So obviously that kind of thing does play a role. When it comes to the art that's being censored, I guess it isn't as direct as that. The correlation isn't as direct, but of course that any institution, I'm sure, is getting funding from more conservative groups who are positioned on, of course, protecting children online, but often protecting children from the body online, and which would be at odds. I can't say that for sure. What I can say is the reason why it's especially disappointing is that a lot of museums and institutions have themselves faced censorship of art historical work that they have in their own collections, and if the public is unable to access that kind of content online, there is a massive problem, and they should be able to take those extra steps also to see how it's affecting artists currently today, particularly the ones that they purport to support, artists among minority communities particularly. So it's hard to say. I think that it often really, what I have seen over the years is just an issue that people don't realize how big the issue is. Artists who aren't experiencing it directly often just can't even see, because that artwork is just being removed online. It's not in their vision. Literally, they can't see the protests. They can't see any of it. They are unaware. So that's a lot of what our campaign is about, is just making it so that a larger art community can understand why it implicates them. There is this interesting correlation or connection that I've seen in the last few years. Say, when I started the Exposure Therapy Project, there really wasn't conversation in the art community about the relationship between Free the Nipple and art. Now, that's a question that gets brought up at panel discussions that I've been on and seen. I've gotten to write about that issue for arts journals, about particularly Free the Nipple. Now we can see this connection between the two, and it is a kind of, I think, publicly maybe more and more understood that there is this overlap. And that's a good step towards, maybe the public and more artists understanding there's something wrong here. There are things that we're not allowed to see. Why are we assuming we're not allowed to see them? What are we assuming about it? It's starting to trigger a mental process. But years ago, before I joined Don't Delete Art, maybe, this was rarely connected, but we're seeing it connected more and more.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like the public should be angry about this. Personally, I feel like I'm being brainwashed into believing one thing. I suppose it's a big word, but I'm being brainwashed into believing one thing. And it's the reason why maybe everyone was sat on that beach staring at that woman who was going about her day. Having some awareness of that is, I suppose, the first step in taking back some control, making up your own mind about what's right and wrong with regards to this. And you've said that the website on Don't Delete Art has a gallery that gives a platform for artists that have been censored in other online spaces. What kind of artists feature on there, and why do you choose them?
So we gather these censorship reports. Within those censorship reports, we ask for, the media that was censored. So we ask artists to send us any screenshots of the information that they received from whatever platform they were on, and also the artwork that was censored. And when we're reviewing all of those censorship reports, we also will pull out artists that we believe the original concept of the gallery was a curated gallery. So we, the founding artists that were involved with the project were called co-curators, and what they were focused on was curating this gallery. To a great extent, we still maintain that philosophy of a curated gallery where we constantly are moving it around, bringing in new artists that exemplify certain particular issues that we're seeing online, or artwork that we especially think is exemplary of, like, this is the artwork we're losing. It is a personal preference, as any curating is, but it is discussed among the team. And the artist that isn't put in the gallery is also given all the resources that we possibly have to continue to work with us, or to send us more of what's happening to them, share the cause.
I see. And moving on from the gallery, like, are there any other plans for the Don't Delete Art movement that we've not talked about?
Moving forward, we have a few things we're working on. We recently just published our first report with the Free Muse State of Artistic Freedom report that comes out every year. It's a pretty comprehensive report that is valued by a lot of different governments and NGOs and other groups that are working in the artistic freedom field. And this is the first time that Don't Delete Art was able to publish within that report on the state of artistic freedom during 2023, 2024 online. So we're using more of our information towards collaborative research, as well as with Ellis Alicante, which is a research group based out of here in Spain, but is an international research group that is particularly looking at the way that algorithms are affecting the way that art is seen online, and the kind of art that is being erased or downranked online. They've recently written a couple of papers that we were grateful to be able to contribute to, using artwork from the Don't Delete Art Gallery and the artists who have submitted artwork to us with their permission, of course. And we are intent on collaborating with as many digital rights groups as we can to make sure that the artists' issues that we're facing are also advocated for among digital rights groups who are advocating for other digital rights concerns and free expression concerns across the internet. And we have a few digital physical projects in mind for this next year that we're building, so that people can interact with the art that has been censored online and learn more about the project and spread the information. Information spreading is kind of the key.
Great. I'm excited to follow it and see these new developments. And is there anything else that Art versus the Algorithm listeners can do to support the Don't Delete Art movement, besides signing the manifesto or going to the website to do that?
Yes, of course, I can sign the manifesto, but following Don't Delete Art on Instagram, that is our primary location where we're sharing information on social media. Following us on Instagram and sharing our posts, sharing the message, doing what you can to educate yourself about the issues, not just complain and worry about what's happening online, but understand why it's happening. We're doing our best to try to educate as to why these things are happening, and then what we can do about the why. So educating yourself is key. You are a stakeholder in the online environment as an art viewer, as an art lover, as an art maker, as just a user of online spaces. You are a stakeholder, and what happens in those spaces is important to you, and you are important to it. So just making sure that you're taking up the space that you deserve to have in that, and saying, I deserve to see art that I want to see. That's important. So make yourself part of the conversation and amplify the message of Don't Delete Art, amplify your own thoughts on the issue.
Well, I've definitely found this conversation very educational, and I'm going to seek more through the Don't Delete Art campaign. And just for a slightly lighter hearted end to the show, so I want you to pick a body part from a list that I'm going to give you. Each one corresponds to a question. Once I've asked you the question, I'll ask you to fill in the gap with your own question, which can either be fun or deadly serious, and I'll give that to a future guest to answer. So your options are either head, legs, boobs, bum, or hands.
I think hands.
Okay. Hans, okay. Who or what is your biggest inspiration in the work that you do?
I always feel silly about this, but it is serious. It's Emma Goldman. Like when I was a young kid, I saw the show Ragtime and became obsessed with Emma Goldman, who was a real life anarchist activist in the United States. She herself a refugee. And of course, was drawn to her because she had my name at first, but then I've always just really, since her, admired older women who just have spent their lives standing in their truth and advocating for others. And I just hope that one day I can be one of those older women who is not deterred and has made sure that her voice was heard for as much of her life as possible for the things that she cared about in society. So that has been my biggest influence and who I hope to emulate in that way.
Well, I think you're doing a very good job at it so far, and I'm excited to keep following how you develop with this. But yeah, I mean, I've heard of two of those, exposure therapy and Don't Delete Art, prior to reaching out to you, and your involvement in both of those things is clearly having an impact. So yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much.
Art versus the algorithm. So, which side are you on? You've been listening to Art versus the Algorithm, hosted and produced by Will Preisner, music by Ned Wolfgang Kelly, voiceover by Alexia Kombu.